We'll go to F4, information on 45-day revision to the district. I didn't know there was any, I'm
I
sorry.
apologize, I'm sorry. I fell asleep on the job here. Corey Bream.
Oh, golly. Don't burst our bubbles.
So one of your new hires, Dr. Mills, is John Shetler. I shouldn't say hire, but promotion. So John and I and a few other parents went to Chime School in Woodland Hills, Thousand Oaks. I'm sorry, I get them confused, but in that area. And it was great to have a district member go along because it's a different ideology of school. It's sort of a program that's set up to be an example. It's 20% special needs, and that's higher than most districts. It's a charter school. People try to get in. They've recently moved the 6th or 7th and 8th grade in with the elementary school, so they're not classified yet as K through 8, but that'll probably come because they're working more and more together as they're on the same campus. So during this interview, look at, visit, it was really interesting to me. Chime isn't doing anything we couldn't do. Not a single thing they're doing is that special and definitely not costly. So I think more of us need to reach out to other schools that already have something in place that is perhaps something we'd like to model, pick up what we can, and nothing changes overnight. I'm not silly, but I think that some of those changes are really interesting. They don't pull the kids out to do speech. They bring speech into the room and they pull some of the ESL kids aside. And so the kids that are sort of maybe borderline needing a little help, and then the one who, of course, the speech language is for, they bring the speech into the room and do it. They modify everything. It's interesting. They claim my son's homework is modified. It's not. It's not at all modified. I get the same exact packet I copy for all the other kids. I know. I copied them. So, you know, it's really interesting. So Kathy was showing me this today, and Angel gets the exact same spelling words, and they're dotted, and he has to trace them because his script writing ability isn't that great, but he gets the same spelling words, and he gets pictures with the words. This is modified. This is integration. We don't have that yet. And we could. This doesn't take but a little extra time. The other thing that I think Chime does that we're not doing, and it was really interesting, again, they are not doing anything that costs a lot of money. Can I emphasize that again? Because I think that's so important. They're mandating that their teachers meet each and every day for a few minutes.
30 seconds.
And they give educational classes weekly that are pertinent to certain grade levels. And then they give educational classes monthly to the whole school. And they're mandated. It's not please come, can you come, did you come, did you sleep during the meeting? I mean, they're really expected to be there and learn it. And it's an expectation. It's a change in thought process. They're not spending more money on special ed than we are. They're just doing it better. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bream.
Now we'll go to F4, information on 45-day revision to the district budget based on final adoption of state budget.
Well, the effect on the district budget of the final state budget is a serious matter. And I'm glad that we have plenty of time tonight so that we can devote some time to what this means to our budget and what we expect as a result. Eric Smith, our deputy superintendent, will make this presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Sarvis. The Ed Code requires that anytime the state adopts their budget, if there's material changes in our budget as a result, we do a 45-day revision. As you know, we're under a constitutional obligation to adopt our budget by June 30th, and the state generally adopts their budget much later. 100 days this year. So what do I have to say about that? Well, we have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that basically a lot of the agony we thought we were going to see at the May revision went away. The bad news is for how long. Some of the things that we looked at the May revision, specifically the 3.85% reduction to our revenue, which, as you remember, first started out as targeted cuts against administration. Then when they realized, well, hey, there's not enough administration to cut, then it was basically, well, you still need to make the cut, but boards will have discretion on where to cut. And also coupled with the fact that they were employing a negative COLA, those things were very problematic for us. And looking on a multi-year basis at June 30th, we looked at about $4.5 million we'd have to cut going into next year. Once our books were closed, we came back, and given that our ending balance was a little bit better than we expected, we reduced that number to $3 million. Well, the net effect of the things that are in this budget, which is the final state adopted budget, is the 3.85% cut went away, as well as the negative COLA, and that's about $3 million in ongoing revenue. The issue is that the state's budget is basically built on a very shaky foundation, and the question is one, will we see mid-year cuts, or two, when the new governor's budget comes out in January, is it going to be, a very ugly budget? Nevertheless, we adhere to the industry standard, and the industry standard is the School Services of California dartboard, and basically it says these things are real and we need to plan for them. So that has a couple of effects for us. One, it reduces the amount we have to cut probably in November, because you remember the county office was requiring that we submit a list of board-approved cuts prior to December 15th, along with our interim report, down to about $500,000, I would say. So we have that plan almost prepared. We'll be bringing it for the board's first reading on the 9th, the 8th and 9th. And from what I gather, it's all non-personnel related. So I think the board will be pleased to hear that. So the issue is what's going to happen beyond that. We get a breather here because we'll be able to make those reductions submitted, but I can't guarantee that in the spring, we might not be back at it, and we'll just have to see what it looks like. Obviously, there's the outside chance things could improve, but I believe there's a lot of questionable revenue assumptions in the state's budget, and it's a budget of expediency, and so we'll have to go back and take a look at it. Obviously, the structural problem still exists at the state level, but I want to really talk about some of the highlights in this budget. Obviously, the revenue limit, just the reduction of the negative COLA, the elimination of that was about $229,000 in the elementary and $259,000 in the secondary. The 3.85% deficit elimination was about another $2.6 million, so you're about $3.1 million there in ongoing revenue. Another unintended consequence is that anytime you start to play with the variables between state aid, enrollment, and property values, well, since the elementary district was on the cusp in basic aid, you mess with the deficit, it drives them out of basic aid status back into revenue limit status. So right now you're in revenue limit status in both districts, and that's probably not going to change. I doubt we're going to see rapid AV growth. We could be deficited back into basic aid status in the spring, or we might not be, and that's the difficulty of being on the cusp. The budget included some one-time money couched in terms of reimbursement of mandated cost reimbursements. We think we're going to see probably about, of the $300 million that was allocated statewide, maybe about $700,000 in one-time money. Obviously, we'd recommend that you kind of put that aside to hedge against mid-year cuts. The really kind of excruciating cuts that were going to be made to child care off the table, so that's good to see. And as Carrie mentioned, the AB 3632 funding issue is an issue for us as well. AB 3632 was basically the funding provided for mental health services for students. It was included in the budget, and then the governor line item vetoed it. What I saw today on the wire is, people are already gearing up to litigate that. I think it's wise that we enter into some kind of interim solution, but I don't think that fight is over with yet. And so hopefully we'll prevail down the road. So at this point, we're just asking you to kind of absorb all this. We'll be bringing this back, with our recommendations in November. We'll kind of lay out the chronology of events, what has occurred, where we need to go, and hopefully have all that stuff done in November so we can bring you the first interim report in December and get that submitted to the county education office. And I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Do we have public comment? No, okay. Questions? Mrs. Deacon?
I don't have a question, I just have a comment. It's how great to have some good fiscal news as opposed to bad. I mean, I almost don't know how to process it because it's like, is it real? Yeah, can I really believe this? But I think it is real.
Yeah, and that's the issue a lot of school districts and county offices are having right now. It's in the state budget, basically, we adhere to the industry standard, which is the dartboard. It's on the dartboard, but then you have a lot of people saying, is it really real, But at this point, we got to accept it as real. And so I think the way I look at it, if nothing else, it gives us a breather, because otherwise we'd be looking at $3.5 million worth of cuts in November, and you know how difficult that was to put that together in February. And buy some time, maybe things will improve, who knows?
Mrs. Parker?
Yes, I appreciate the breather too. In typical years, we've made budget cuts in April. And of course, this past year, we did it early in February. And this idea of doing it in November was really, really very worrisome. And so I appreciate that if nothing else, maybe we can get back onto a more normal budget cycle schedule. So we'll see.
Yeah, that's really our intention, to get back to a more normal schedule. Although this one was really precipitated by the county's worry that districts would be in severe financial trouble and that they'd better start planning by the time of the first interim report so that they knew what cuts they were going to anticipate.
Yeah, and I think, that's not limited just to our county. That's a discussion that's been occurring among county offices statewide. I mean, basically, it's like, hey, it's the way it's explained to me, and it's kind of funny because when they talk to me, they know I've sat in that chair, It's like, well, just because you put a $4 million negative cut in your multi-year, do we accept that just because we trust you as the CBO? And it used to be on a one-year basis, that was probably good enough if you had a good enough relationship. But then we see multiple years of this. As you know, it gets more difficult every year. And as I've explained to my staff in the county, the board gets fatigued. It's not only just staff who's scratching their head on how to come up with it. The board becomes fatigued of going through it. And so don't think I'm not sensitive to that.
Yeah, at the meeting I went to with all the other districts in the area, basic aid districts, now I find out I can't go back again.
Yet, Ed.
I can
You
check-
never know. You might be back in
I
April.
can check off one meeting, but they were all leery. They were, to a T, they were afraid of what might happen, after the first of the year. So.
Well, and I think the difficulty is that it's interestingly enough because I believe the fair share went away for them too as part of this, and but there's people up in Sacramento that have it out for basic aid districts.
That was the biggest worry they had, and they said, better play the game and better be good, but don't just don't go overboard on anything.
And some of them are just barely into basic aid. They may be forced into revenue limit status as well.
Mr. Herron, may I
Yes,
just
Mrs. Parker.
chime back in on that? Because I really want to clarify for any public that are watching, because I hear so much confusion about basic aid versus revenue limit, and like, why don't you choose basic aid, things like that. And I think that the important point here is that you may get more money from basic aid, but in this case, you're going to get more money from the revenue limit.
Right.
It is a positive thing to have a higher amount of money coming, even though it means that we are a revenue limit district. So it's not a negative to not be basic aid if you have more money coming in.
If you've seen the bucket analogy and you've seen the graphic, what you're saying is how big is your bucket? right?
Right,
It'd
so
be
the
better to
bucket
have a
just got
big
bigger.
bucket. you know.
That's right. Better to have a big bucket regardless of whether it's filled with
Right.
basic
Yeah.
aid or revenue,
Yeah,
right?
get a big bucket. Okay, well, thank you very much for that cheery news. That's great. Okay, we have no, item G, we have nothing to go back to. Coming events. I'd like to comment, just, the second meeting in November, which is Dr. Noel's last meeting, SEAC is putting on a reception for him in the grounds out here, and so anybody who would like to be part of that event, I'm sure it's just a matter of coming, and we thank SEAC for putting that on. Now, we have to make sure Dr. Noel gets here. Okay. Yeah. Other coming events? Okay, how about future agenda items? Nope, no future? Nope. Well, I come to think about it, we did have a psychologist here tonight, and that might be an issue sometime when when you have the proper time to, at least for us to look at that issue and respond. If that is a serious problem, we'd like to know about it, and somebody let us know. I would not want to just ignore it. And then another thing that Mrs. Park and I've heard at a couple meetings, and again, from one of your future agenda items, I would like a review of the reasons and issues and what went behind taping closed sessions. Because we both heard at meetings now that that's not a recommended process. And I understand we had to do it at one time, but SB, the school board administration, their attorney told us, one of their attorneys who does policy, said it's not a good idea. And then a previous meeting also, I went to Rancho Cucamonga, they said it's not a good idea and wondered why we did it. So I found out why we've done it, but I think it's wise for us to look at that and determine if it's still something we should be doing. It probably takes an analysis by somebody to go through the history of how we happen to be doing it. But it's been recommended twice now that that it's not a good practice to tape closed session hearings. So at some point on your agendas, put that down. Anything else? I mean, it's 10:15. Do you want to just sit here for a
Yeah,
while?
we'll just
or
chat for a while.
Close the meeting.
That's one of the key issues. To me, that seems a really basic aspect of making sure that, appropriate instruction is taking place in the classroom. And so I guess where I'm trying to get to is where do we, how do you generate that, I don't know, esprit de corps maybe, among the faculty to embrace that as their own, and promote greater faculty awareness of school-wide learning goals, especially diversity and tolerance, that are embedded within instruction. And I think that's a key part there, that are embedded within instruction. And so, yeah, I guess being a teacher myself, I feel like it's less effective to try to impose something on teachers. It's more effective to try to, get teachers to embrace it, but that's also usually harder. So I'm wondering, how we making that part happen.
The biggest, probably the single number one response I can give you is the work that they're doing in PLCs.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's new, it's new. Requiring them to do now what PLCs do, and monitoring that is a major step in making that happen. It isn't going to change overnight. That part I do know, and it's not frustrating. It's just part of the culture. The part about, and you discussed several things, but when you talk about alignment of curriculum, these are things that we can share that need to be done. Those are things that we can mandate. The implementation of those things, we have to go observe to see if that indeed is happening in the classrooms. So there's got to be additional monitoring. It's pretty clear we have to be out there a lot more than we are now. The other piece of that is working with your common groups, if you have a common core group in algebra, what are some of the best practices and how are they sharing that information? And it goes back to this whole notion of sharing data in a more comprehensive manner. It isn't just about how well my kids are doing. It's more about if they're not doing well, what do I do about it? So it's really self-generating, and it is not something that you can impose. You can't make anybody do these things because it just gets all sour.
Mhm.
So between the PLCs and the common practices that they're starting to embrace, and I will share, this has not been an easy task at this high school. I'd be foolish if I could sit here and say, we'll have it done, or it could have been done by now. It's been a challenge. This is very difficult. But there's movement, and that's good news for us. And we also, in generating through the use of this book, and I don't want to say this is the godsend. I just want to say, and it's not all the answer, but it is something that has our staff communicating, and that's something that we weren't doing a year ago. We weren't doing that. And so when you have 40 or 50 people, we do this twice. We have late start Wednesdays, and we have 2 meetings because we have 0 period classes. So we have about half the group meeting at 7 and the other half meeting about 8, and it's what they've agreed to do. There's a lot of conversation, and it's healthy. It's so much different than it was before. It's having a conversation and starting to talk and having somebody stand up and say, we don't do these at this high school, which is what I got 3 years ago or 4 years ago. The dialogue is now, this is what I do in my classroom if I see this. And somebody else will add to that. So it's more about building upon what was said prior. And so I would offer that in the best sense of what we laugh about as being violent agreement, we're starting to agree on many things, which I think is healthy. That wasn't happening a couple of years ago. It just wasn't taking place.
Okay, thank you.
I just have 2 or 3 quick things, and I have discussed these with you in depth.
Right.
So I can use a short answer, but I'm
Okay.
not sure about the rest. But I'm just curious, what can we as a board do, or what can we administrative do? In here, it talks about Edusoft training, gradebook areas, 60% of your staff use it. You've told me now it's closer to 80% possibly.
Yeah.
But that's an aspect of parent involvement, having the availability for parents to get involved with their children. What do you think needs to be done on that?
Are you referring to Edusoft or Aries?
Well, it says Edusoft, but also the gradebook, areas.
Okay. Those are
Two different things,
right.
but they both are spelled out in here as being lacking.
Yeah. The one thing about Edusoft is I was so excited when I got here and realized that Wayne Cole was starting this process, and this was 4 years ago, and since then he's just gone crazy, and I've used this thing for years. It's one of the most powerful tools that is out there that we really need to start to enforce a little bit more. Now, we do this, again, with the PLCs, because now, with the PLCs, they're forced to look at data and really seriously look at it. Without the data, there's no sense in having the meeting, because everything that we do is data-driven. So more and more teachers are, in fact, since then, it is probably closer to 80% are using, Edusoft and scanning their own materials and doing the work. There are still people who are, technophobic, really. And you can't do damage to these things. You can't do it wrong, but they're still shy of getting in there with the computers and the technology. That just is more training. So what can be done? It's time. It's time. We had a discussion even today about when do we do the things that we're supposed to be doing? How do we get as much professional development out of this as we possibly can? And I think those are strategies that as a board we could look into even together.
We need to do that.
Yeah. And the same thing, now the gradebook is more and more people are using the gradebook. And our requirement is that if you're not on gradebook and a student comes and asks you for a grade report, it needs to be turned in now. You need to be able to do that today, because everybody else can log in and see exactly how their kid's doing. And if you're not using gradebook, if they don't have that same accessibility, it becomes a problem at this high school. And I think we're seeing some significant changes there as well.
In here, it said your counselor ratio is 430 to 1.
No, it's 409.
409, okay. It said your math for geometry and algebra is 22 to 1. Have you gotten your math and your algebra and geometry classes down into that 20 range?
They're down into the 20 range.
Okay.
Yeah.
The low 20 range?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
In the areas that we can, we still have new kids coming to school, so you're going to see some imbalances, but we all see some imbalances.
Okay.
But the greater effort to get them down is taking place, yes, has taken place.
The last thing has to do with this student engagement.
Mhm.
Last year, we put in place an attendance support program that the other high schools are using, and you're not. You're using your own program for truancy purposes. Last year, if you're going to teach kids and get student involvement, they need to be in their seats.
Right.
And you had 26,000 periods of truancy last year, which was double most any other high school. I know you're redoing that program this year, so I don't really want to know about last year, but what are you doing this year to get that 26,000 number down to some reasonable number?
Well, I don't know about the statistics, so I'll be frank, I don't know that was a number that was brought forward, and I have no place to
We had a report
debate.
on it here
Right.
at our meeting.
The one concern that we have is, and I'll be just as honest as I can, that program was being mismanaged last year. It just wasn't being managed well, because it demands that it is a 5-tiered system that requires us to intervene with parents and counselors. And through my own observations, and after I received that information, going back to the counselors and the administrators, they weren't having the parent conferences. So the program was not being implemented at all. Oh, we're too busy, no. So our focus this semester is targeted on that. It will work. And it's within a short period of time, it should work. Kids are not just being removed, but the series of interventions, we're meeting now a greater number of parents, so many parent meetings, and the goal isn't to drop. The greater goal is to get them in those classrooms and in the seats. The intervention piece that we have really speaks to what can we do for your kid if they don't want to be in school? What do we do for your son or daughter? And that's really what we're trying to focus on, is getting the parents involved and the kids involved to the point that they're finding out in a district like this that has 240 units, if you miss a class, your graduation has been pushed away by 1 semester. So it's critical that they're in their seats, and that's really what we're focusing on.
Yeah, I would hope so, because if you're going to have your own program, it better work.
I agree.
Okay. Anything else? Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.
It was a great report put together. You've got a lot of work ahead of you.
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Thank your staff for us. Okay, we will go to F5, and we have 22 minutes to finish the agenda. David Hetyunk.
Well, this fortunately is a brief item. We've talked about this a number of times. This has to do with measures Q and R and the kinds of projects that we would take on at the schools. Dave Hetyunk will explain a matrix that he has put together and worked with Eric Smith on.
Thank you, Dr. Sarvis. As requested from the board, we did develop a matrix plugging in projects off the list previously provided to the board with the priorities that were suggested to the board. Again, neither this total list nor these priorities have received board action. These are just suggestions, comments, and trying to anticipate what may happen in the future should measures Q and R be successful. As indicated in the cover memo, I did add one priority, protecting the asset. As I mentioned last time, you're protecting a building from the elements, whether it be from the roof or the walls or from water intrusion under the doors. It's important to protect what we have. And so I added that, took the leeway of adding it as a priority. The board can make comment on that. This was just my first stab at putting X's in things. I've been through it a couple times. I got a lot of little tweaks and changes. Just one thing for San Marcos High School, at the top of their list, it says ADA restrooms. That should say ADA and restrooms. We have some ADA work there to do other than restrooms that's required still to meet requirements of the Division of State Architect from past projects. Although we met the requirements of our lawsuit settlement, Division of State Architect still has additional requirements, and they're going to impose those if we go forward with the new wing or anything else on that campus. So with that, I'd be open for comments from board members on how we laid out the matrix, any questions or of why I did what, or any suggestions for changes.
Mrs. Deacon?
Well, I seem to recall I was involved in this initial idea, and I look at it now and I think, boy, this doesn't make it a whole lot easier. I mean, I appreciate all the work, but I'm looking at the fact that some of the principal requested items fall far below the top tier.
It's
So it
called
gives us-
flexibility.
I know, and it certainly, but it's helpful, and I appreciate it, and it
Right.
gives us a place to start. And I also, I spoke to you about this earlier. I initially was a little concerned I didn't see more X's in the green column, but I think the important point to make is a lot of the projects, like classroom modernization, are absolutely going to
Right.
improve energy efficiency. And so in many ways, almost all of these would have a green
Yeah.
check mark by them.
Correct. There's a lot of subjectivity to what we're attempting to do here. And, you know, it's a very valid point. Every time we do a classroom modernization, we put in more efficient lighting, we replace a boiler that takes more energy. That is a green project. My initial placement of the X's were the photovoltaics that would possibly happen at our larger campuses. Would definitely be a green, kind of you hit the green and alleviate general fund at the same time, because those would. And in fact, all of our modernizations, the same way they'd be green, they would help alleviate the general fund because they would theoretically lower our utility bills. So there's a lot of places you can go through, depending on how subjective you want to be, or where you want to draw the line, you could add more X's. But I think the good news is that most of the bolded items that were the principal's first priorities, those are at the top or near the top. But then again, it's like I said, from a facilities point of view, a priority may be different than an operational point of view from a principal, and you really have to balance those and listen to both sides. And it by no means that what that principal thinks isn't the most important thing for that campus may not be the most important thing.
Right. And I'll just close with saying at some point, cost is going to have to come into this.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we didn't know how to assign a point value to that.
Well, let me pick up on that if you don't mind. One of the things that concerns me and has for a long time is that there's a perception that this fund of money, we can start spending it. And as I understand it, in the elementary district, we have about $15 million that we might start getting in 2011, and we won't get any more until 2015. So I think there needs to be a column or some type of criteria. What's the most important to spend our money on? Because if you just take two libraries, that's going to take an awful lot of the $15 million. Or if you just take the portables changing the portables at San Marcos and put new buildings in, that's going to take a lot of the $35 million that we might get in 2011. And so I think we have this perception out there that we've got 35 million and 75 million, but a lot of that is a long time off. And so are there things on this list that, hey, we have to spend now, or we really won't have an asset to protect 4 years from now?
Correct.
And so sometimes the protect asset, to me, takes maybe more of a weight than some of the other things. Or the ADA or settlement takes more of a weight. It's not, every check mark is not equal. Yeah, so
Yeah,
we
I'd
have
like to
15
address
million
that.
to spend. How are we going to spend it? Dr. Sarvis? Or Mr. Cordero?
Go ahead.
That was gonna be my exact comment, that I felt like, the score, to me, was not helpful, I didn't quite know exactly what to do with that score, because there are some things that I think ADA settlement and code safety, and code and safety, DSA, are, some of those are just sort of have to do things. We don't have a lot of choice. And so they take priority whether or not they have the highest score. And so I appreciated having the X's in the columns, because that helped me see which items addressed which areas. But I would not like us to consider them based on the total score. I think we need to look at which items it is that they are they are fulfilling, and not just say if they have 3, it's better than if they have 2. And so I can understand why you put that there, and it was sort of helpful to have them in, the descending order to see which ones fulfilled more, but I don't want us to really use that as we prioritize the items.
And I would say that if you asked me for my recommendations or my department recommendations, it would not be to follow the list from 4 down to 0.
4 to 3, yeah.
Or 3 down to 0, depending on what is there. But it does help, like you say, it does help identify what does this project address, how many of the areas does it address, and then you can look at the money available and reprioritize, within that criteria.
In fact, the purpose of this report is to do just exactly that. It's to identify how many of those areas these projects do address. And we purposely did not want to bring a list of recommended priorities to you now before the election. We really think that we need to wait for the election, then we need to go into detailed conversations about what the priorities should be. And at that point, we will bring you a list of recommended priorities, and they won't be do the 4s first, do the 3s second.
Well, I hope that that's clear to any public who see this list. Where
Well,
it says score, that doesn't
Yes.
really mean a priority level or a priority
We-
score.
Yes, we really only assigned the numbers because we understood that the board was asking for that.
Mrs. Parker?
Thank you. It makes me feel a little bit better because it did, I think some of the projects, when I looked at them and where they got the X's and where they didn't, surprised me. But I could see adding a column for either site priority or instructional priority. Again, all that would do ultimately, I mean, I think that those are important things that we have to take into consideration. But then again, I want to be careful about how that slides over into where it goes in the priority list. But again, I mean, I've seen this before. I mean, I started coming to board meetings around the I-98. I've watched this for years, and it is frustrating, and it's really hard, and it's hard being on this side this time. And I can only hope that this is a big problem, because we won't know for sure until November 3rd. But I know that we will look at this very carefully as a board, and I know that you guys will scrutinize this in the as principals, as
And principals, while they had the project lists and they gave input, they've not had a chance yet to give input to any of this. The first time many of them will see this is when it was published, so, if Q and R do pass, there's a few steps that have to be taken from my department. Number one is get back in touch with the schools. That to me is a
I just
given.
want to we have it really clear that this money is coming in stages. And so
Oh, yes.
everything's not going to be done,
That is one
and
of the
maybe some of these
important
things will
point.
be 10 years before it gets done.
Correct.
So got to understand that aspect of this process and determine what needs to be done now.
Mr. Herron, since we're putting our caveats on the table, may I also once again caution the board that I do not believe that it would be appropriate to turn the prioritization over to an oversight committee. I believe that that's a board function. We need to come back to the board, have the discussions with the board, with the entire board, and make those decisions at the board level.
Okay.
I agree, and I just wanted to go back to one thing Mrs. Cordero mentioned, which was, I think when we first talked about this, we did talk about weighting some of these categories more heavily than others, and certainly the things that we have to do, like the ADA piece, before we can even move forward on any of the others, is going to come into play in the decision-making process.
I consider this a first-run draft.
Thank you for the effort. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, we'll move to F.
Public comment.
Oh, okay. Mr. Wheeler.
Lane Wheeler?
Lane Wheeler, President of Santa Barbara Teachers Association, concur with you that this, we may be getting slightly ahead of ourselves, but I will celebrate the activity that we have made so much progress on, and that's getting this conversation to this level. So that's something that I think we collectively the board should take some credit for and having the foresight to bring this forward. That being said, a couple of comments. Timeline is certainly one that we'd like to see happen on this. Making sure the timeline is very clearly identified and how the process is going to move forward, and also creating that priority list. Obviously, this is a first shot at this, and it's not set in stone. I had very large concerns when I heard Mr. Hetjank describing this, and I heard principal, 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 and I did not hear teacher, because the teachers speak for the students. And if your classroom is sweltering hot, or your internet is not working, or there's a trip and fall hazard that's there, those comments need to be heard. Constantly, we have teachers who aren't, we just heard in the last report from Santa Barbara High, the inability to use particular software programs because they don't have the internet connectivity, or it runs at the speed of a 1928 Ford Model T or A or whatever the model is. Some of those things may become priorities as we start looking at that instructional plan, as you mentioned, Ms. Parker. So I would definitely like to have teachers involved in at least a consideration. I'd like to know clearly what we see as the timeline and how those chunks of money would be filtering in and how we do that. And kind of kicking back to what you all had discussed at a prior board meeting, the idea of those repair projects that are the ones that you notice that you sort of skin your knee on and cause a lot of aggravation to you on, and how do we get those prioritized back into this? And certainly, please take time to at least evaluate the staff that's there, hear what they're having troubles with and what they're having issues with. We may find out that that's like a Venn diagram, that there's a central area where we really need to concentrate, and I would ask you to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I did forget one thing. Wireless internet got no marks all the way across for anybody, but yet we do have 3 schools that are now going wireless. So in the interest of parity, maybe the other schools should have it too. So maybe some X marks and parity for the other schools. And that saves a lot of money if we do it correctly. According to the report I saw, we save a lot of money because we're going to have to rewire the schools anyway, because our infrastructure is not that good in some of the schools, as I understand it. So, well, I got Dr. Hayden shaking his head, and I got Mr. Hetjank in amazement. So, will the two of you talk to each other? Okay. Thank you. Let's go now on to F6.
And Eric Smith, our Deputy Superintendent, will present this.
Thank you, Dr. Sarvis. On August 10th, the President signed into law H.R. 1586, commonly referred to as the Education Jobs Bill. The intent of this law is to be used for compensation and benefits and other expenses necessary to retain existing employees, or to recall or rehire former employers, or to hire new employees in order to provide early childhood, elementary, or secondary education and related services. This includes, among other things, salaries, performance bonuses, health insurance, retirement benefits, incentives for early retirement, pension fund contributions, union reimbursement, or tuition reimbursement, rather, student loan repayment assistance, transportation subsidies, and reimbursement for child care expenses. Now, time for me to take a breath there. The use of these funds is really permitted only on teachers, principals, assistant principals, academic coaches, in-service trainers, classroom aides, counselors, librarians, basically everything under the sun, with the exception of district office staff and administration. So we've been notified by the California Department of Ed that we'll receive 90% of our entitlement here, which is roughly $800,000 in the elementary district and $2 million in the secondary district. And we need to start talking about the process of how we're going to use these one-time funds. We are in discussions with both SBTA and CSEA about what they'd like to see us use, but we've been very clear that the board was going to give us direction about what the board's priorities are, and that'd be a jumping off point for us. So at this point, we're just bringing the information to you, looking for feedback and some direction in terms of what might be some of the board's priorities to facilitate these discussions with our employee associations.
There is a new F6 with a date change in the second paragraph.
I probably should point out that these funds can only be used for expenses that were incurred after August 10th, 2010, when the bill was signed into law, and we can actually hold on to this funds all the way until September of 2012. So we have about a year and a half if we want to try and stretch things out, if we're thinking about positions or anything of that nature. But I think the intent of the law was to try and get the money on the street as soon as possible.
That's hard to do in the middle of this. Year's already started. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
Mrs. Parker.
Well, I do think it's important for us to keep in mind that we'll be really looking in November at the budget and how this fits into the overall picture there. It'd be foolish for us to do anything with one-time money that would then put us in a position where we're laying off people. And so I want to be sure that that's all in the mix. Having said that, I'm very aware of the rising healthcare costs that our employees have faced in particular. I'm very aware that it's been a very tough 2 years. And I'm very aware that we have administrators on furlough days. And I wish that this had come earlier so that we could have put it in play in terms of staffing before the school year started. I want to be careful that what we're doing is best for students and not disruptive. But I can't tell you how grateful I am to be here having this discussion right now, and I'm looking forward to how this can mitigate the really dire educational fiscal environment that's been true in the state and in our district to whatever limited extent that it can. I appreciate that.
Mrs. Cordero.
Well, I would echo a lot of what Ms. Parker said, but I also just, I'm thrilled that these funds are available. I just think it's really important that we continue to sort of recommit to the notion that we don't spend one-time monies on ongoing, in ways that create ongoing costs.
You don't use it for things that eat.
Exactly, yeah. So.
That's not my line. That's a Ron Bennett line for School Services of California. But it conjures up a good visual there, you know.
So, I mean, I think we probably really do need to wait until the budget, until we're looking at our budget and until the state budget is clearly defined. But I think there are some things that we could do on a one-time basis with these one-time funds that could help to offset some of the things that we've had, some of the costs to some of our employees or some of the impacts that Ms. Parker was mentioning. But we would have to keep it on a one-time basis, and that's just my biggest concern.
Boy, I've trained you guys well.
You have.
Yeah.
We've learned.
One thing about waiting till November, I'll just toss it out, is we do have a furlough day in November.
That's correct.
What do we need, if we wanted to, what do we need to do to figure out, number one, how much that costs us, and what would?
We have those calculations, but you have two issues. You've got furlough days with CSEA and with management. And if the board was going to take some kind of action, let's say with regard to management, because we'd have to negotiate with CSEA, although we meet with them on Thursday. Remember, you'd also have to be willing to cop up the proportional share of the district office from the unrestricted general fund, because hence the federal ed jobs fund, although I think that's a very small percentage of the pie. But I'm sure Meg has those figures in terms of what the cost of the furlough days for administration was. I can't remember off the top of my head. 60,000? Yeah, that's what I think.
Something to look at, because it is coming in November, and
Well, since that date is coming up, if you want to look at it, you really can't wait until November.
well, that's what my
and
point is.
We've already notified site principals, for example, well, all administrators, that they're going to take the Wednesday before Thanksgiving off. They're not going to get paid for it, They're going to have 2 fewer days in the year. That's one of the days. Another is over winter break. So we wouldn't want to wait until just 2 weeks before to make a decision about it. We'd better bring that back this next meeting.
Yeah, just what the cost is, and is that a proper, is that a proper use of this fund? And how much of that, of these funds would that take? So,
Yeah, I don't think it's gonna take a large portion. I know another thing, I'm just gonna start giving you a stream of consciousness in terms of things that I'd heard, you know, and obviously I'm not gonna talk about anything we talked about in negotiations, but, you know, I can tell you the athletic trainers came forward and said, well, do you think the board would be willing to restore, or the ADs came forward and said, do you think the board would be willing to restore the hours on the athletic trainers? I said, I don't know, you know, I mean, I can ask, I mean, but that's one of those things you could stretch out over 18 months rather than just 1 year. I know the board's also indicated a desire to maybe beef up maintenance. You know, we probably wouldn't want to do that through our traditional routine restricted maintenance, but we have a job classification called multi-craft that we could bring somebody on board for 18 months since we can hang on to this money through September of 12. It's, you know, it'd have to be a limited term position and we would fly it, you know, or if we had a couple of positions, but those are some of the things that, you know, I've been hearing from various sources. Obviously, some of the things that you've mentioned are things that we've heard from other parties as well that I think there's a keen interest in. And, but we could probably come back on the 28th, which we'll be bringing you a report on the state budget at that time, probably the 45-day revise, since we go to a conference tomorrow at the county office about it. And along with that, or in a separate item, we could bring some of these things we could quantify in terms of what the cost would be.
thank you. Mr. Deacon?
I guess just one of my final comments would, on this is this was for jobs. I mean, that's what this money was for. So even though people eat, I mean, that's really what this was all about. And I think to be true to the spirit of what the money was intended for, you know, even if we can extend those positions longer, and maybe the economy will get better later, but I mean, I would love to see us bring back, you know, some people that we had to let go, look at the furlough piece, maybe do something that all of our current employees benefit from. You know, I still want that security officer at Santa Barbara High. I mean, those are the kinds of things, you know, that jumped out at me right away. So that would be the kind of guidance that I would like to look for. Is there any way, if it's too late for the November furlough day for site administrators, is there any way to pay them for a day at the end of the school year?
Well, there certainly is, yes.
Okay, so that's just another thought.
Mrs. Parker?
Yeah, that was one of the things I wanted to bring up, is it seems like, and probably for almost all of our employees, that there's probably a way to address it later in the year rather than having to do it before November, especially because people may have made plans at this point. But I also wanted just to touch on what Mrs. Deacon was raising. It's about jobs. It's about stimulus. It's about getting money back into the economy. So anything that we can do for our employees so that they have more money to spend in our local community, that will make a difference in our community and our state. So I hope we can move forward with something quickly.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Smith. We have no consent items to go back to. Coming events, I think Dr. Sarver's covered those. I thought of one, but I don't know what it was. Okay. Future agenda items. We have a long list. At some point, two things I'd like, at least I'd like, and if nobody else does, just tell me. There is a problem